After emancipation, freedom was declared in law, but protection of that freedom was not guaranteed. So Black families across the country began building lives with urgency and intention, not in theory, in practice. They bought land, they built schools, they organized churches, they kept records, they taught their children what to watch for, because what they built mattered, and they knew it could be challenged. Mound Bayou, Mississippi, founded by Isaiah T. Montgomery, families pooled resources to buy land and establish businesses. Families farmed together, opened stores, built banks. This created a local economy that did not depend entirely on outside systems that could be hostile. When families owned land, they had leverage. When they had leverage, they had options. That was the goal. Eatonville, Florida, families like the Clark and Mosley families were among those who helped shape the town's early leadership. Joseph Clark, who served as mayor and principal, emphasized education as a form of protection. Children were taught to read not only for opportunity, but for awareness. Because if you can read contracts, you are harder to mislead. If you can read laws, you are harder to erase. Families understood that literacy and unity together created stability. That was not abstract. It was daily practice. In Wilmington, North Carolina, Black families who had built businesses and held public office were forced out during the 1898 coup. Families who had lived there for years left homes and property behind. Some never returned. Property changed hands quickly. Records from that time show how entire families were displaced almost overnight. So in other towns, families paid attention. They saw what could happen when stability became visible.
The opening you've already shared speaks about unity and injury, to one being injury to all. That idea did not come from nowhere. It came from experience. After slavery ended, Black families across the United States stepped into freedom, knowing something important. Freedom could be declared, but not always protected. So, across the country, people began building with intention. Men and women working together to raise the frame of a wooden schoolhouse, tools in hand, community members of all ages participate. The scene captures the collaborative spirit and determination. They built towns where they could govern themselves. They built schools because literacy meant survival. They built churches because community meant protection. They bought land when they could, and when they bought it, they held on tightly. This building was not quiet. It was visible, and visibility often brought pressure. In many parts of the country, when Black communities began to thrive, they were not simply left alone. They were watched, restricted, sometimes displaced, sometimes attacked, not in one single place, across many. And because these patterns repeated, families began to pass down what they learned: guidelines, warnings, strategies, not written in law books, but spoken at kitchen tables, taught in churches, remembered in stories, what we now call the commandments after slavery, not religious commandments, survival commandments. Learn, build, stay together, protect land, protect records, protect one another. Do not assume safety. Do not forget what happened. Do not give up what was built. Because after emancipation, the question was not only, how do we live free? The question was, how do we remain free in a country still deciding what freedom meant? So, across the nation, in places both rural and urban, Black communities began testing these commandments in real time. In Florida, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Texas, North Carolina, California, and beyond, people built towns and neighborhoods meant to be safe places to live, work, and raise children. But the lessons they learned were shared. Hold on to your land, because many families had already seen what could happen when a community became visible, successful, and self-sustaining. This film is the closing chapter of a series that has followed those commandments across different places and times. The towns we're about to revisit are not just locations on a map. They are examples of how people responded when what they built was challenged. From self-governed towns like Eatonville and Mound Bayou to places like Wilmington and Ocoee, to Freedmanstown, Nicodemus, Harris Neck, to Manhattan Beach and beyond. Each one reflects a lesson. Each one reflects a decision. Each one reflects a commandment in action. And when we place these stories side by side, a national picture emerges. Not a single event, not a single moment, but a pattern across time and geography. A pattern of building, a pattern of resistance, a pattern of remembering. That is where we begin this final chapter. By returning to the towns, by connecting the lessons, let's begin there.
In Ocoee, Florida, individuals like Mose Norman and July Perry became known in local accounts connected to the events surrounding the 1920 election. Violence followed attempts to vote. Families fled into nearby woods and towns. Land that had been owned changed hands. For decades, the black population in Ocoee remained extremely small. Families elsewhere heard about Ocoee, and they adjusted. They documented. They stayed connected. They warned their children. At Manhattan Beach, the Bruce family, Charles and Willa Bruce, built a resort that welcomed black visitors to the coast. Their business grew. Their community grew. Then the city used eminent domain. The Bruces lost the property, but their descendants kept records, kept names, kept the story. Nearly 100 years later, that persistence mattered, because when records and memory survive, claims can be made, and sometimes they can be recognized. In Houston's Freedmanstown, many families held on to deeds and records for generations. Property passed down, stories passed down, proof passed down. Because families understood that documentation could protect claims long after individuals were gone, paper mattered, memory mattered, both together mattered. Why names matter? When we say communities, we are talking about families. Real families. Families who built. Families who lost. Families who held on. Families who passed down lessons. So when we talk about the commandments after slavery, we are talking about guidance shaped by lived experience. Learn, build, document, stay connected, hold on, remember. These were not theoretical. They were instructions shared across generations because families saw patterns and responded. As we move forward in this film, we're not only looking at towns, we're looking at decisions families made when they saw what could happen to what they built. And we're asking what those decisions teach us now, because this history is not distant. It lives in land records, family stories, and communities that still remember.
Never back to chains. These events took place in the United States between 1865 and the early 1900s. This film is about what happened after slavery ended, not in Africa, not somewhere else, but here, in the United States, where 4 million people, newly freed, began to build a world. Freedom was not a gift, it was a beginning, and it was fragile. It had to be built, day by day. The first foundation was knowledge. In freedmen's schools, children learned to read and write for the first time. They held slates in their hands, tools more powerful than any they had known before. At night, the work continued. Adults, after a long day in the fields or the workshops, gathered by lantern light. They learned their letters, their numbers. They learned to read the contracts, the laws, the Bible. Teachers came from their own communities. They came from aid societies in the North. They all shared a single radical belief, that education was the pathway to true emancipation. The second foundation was faith. Churches were more than houses of worship. They were the first Black-owned institutions, sanctuaries from a hostile world. They were town halls, where the community gathered to debate and decide its future. They were mutual aid societies, where neighbors supported each other through hardship. Here, voices rose in song, announcements were made, plans were laid. The church was the heart of the community, a place of spiritual strength and collective action. It was a declaration of independence, built of wood and faith. With knowledge and faith came a new civic life. In town meetings and fraternal lodges, people practiced self-governance. They formed councils. They wrote petitions. They learned the mechanics of democracy. Newspapers, printed on small presses, were lifelines. They carried news from across the country. They published essays and arguments. They were read aloud in homes and barbershops, connecting scattered communities into a larger conversation about their rights and their destiny. This was the work of citizenship, claiming a voice in the nation that had for so long denied them one. The ultimate goal was independence, and that meant owning land. To own a piece of America was to put down roots that could not be easily torn up. Families saved for years, dollar by dollar, to buy a plot of their own. The deed, the signature, the fence post in the ground. These were symbols of a profound shift, from being property to owning property. They formed cooperative farms, pooling resources to work the land together. They cared for their tools, their animals, their soil. On this land, they built modest homes with porches and wells. They grew their own food. They created a measure of security, a legacy for their children. From this foundation, enterprise grew. Barbershops, general stores, seamstress shops, and carpentry businesses opened their doors. These were not just places of work, they were centers of community life. Dollars earned here circulated locally, building wealth from within. Every haircut, every repaired wagon, every new dress was a small act of economic self-determination. This was the creation of a local economy, one that served the needs of the community and kept its resources close to home. And with it, culture flourished. Reading circles shared books, shelf by shelf. Brass bands played on town greens. School exhibitions showcased the achievements of the young. This was more than survival. This was life, a life of dignity, creativity, and shared joy. But this progress was never safe. Freedom had to be defended every day. It was defended not just with force, but with quiet courage. With legal petitions filed at the courthouse, with neighbors watching over each other's porches as darkness fell, with church members standing guard through the night. This resilience was a constant, silent promise, a refusal to be intimidated, a refusal to go back. This is not mythology. This is history. It was built with care and kept with courage. And it belongs where it happened. Here, in the homes, churches, schools, and streets of the United States. This story continues.
When the chains of bondage finally fell, our ancestors found themselves in a world that promised freedom but offered little else. In this fragile new dawn, they knew the old rules wouldn't be enough. So they created their own unwritten commandments for survival. And because they were making history with every breath, they left us instructions, a blueprint for navigating a hostile world. This was their legacy, passed down not on paper, but in spirit. You won't find these instructions written in the nation's law books, which so often fail to see their humanity. They are not carved into the cold marble of monuments that celebrate a past that tried to erase them. Instead, they are written in how they lived, in the communities they built from scratch, in the schools they founded to educate their own, in the businesses they started with sheer will. They are written in what they protected. They protected the family, the first sanctuary. They protected the right to learn, the right to vote, the right to own a piece of the land they had tilled for generations. And most fiercely, they are written in what they refuse to lose again, the bonds of kinship, the dignity of a name, the very soul of their people. What they understood was a simple, profound truth, forged in the fires of suffering. Freedom, this precious, hard-won thing, would not survive if they stood alone. An individual could be broken, a family could be scattered, but a community, a people united, that was a fortress. So they made a decision, a pact, a promise, whispered from one generation to the next. They would stand together. Commandment 9. Thou shalt stand together. An injury to one is an injury to all. Division is the enemy of freedom. It was not a law written by a distant hand, but a truth forged in the crucible of shared struggle. A principle etched not just in stone, but into the very heart of their community. It was a fundamental understanding passed down through generations, whispered in quiet moments, and demonstrated in times of trial. This was the unwritten code that held their world together, the foundational belief upon which everything else was built. It was their compass in the storm, their guide through the darkness. They knew division. They understood its seductive whisper, the way it preys on fear and uncertainty. It promised a false sense of individual safety, urging them to lock their doors, to turn away, to believe that the troubles of a neighbor were not their own. It was the quiet poison that could sever the bonds of trust, turning a vibrant community into a collection of isolated, vulnerable strangers. They had seen other towns, other groups, crumble from within, not from the force of an external enemy, but from the slow, corrosive decay of suspicion and selfishness. And they knew it was the fastest way to destroy everything they had built. Not just the homes and the fences, but the shared dreams, the collective memories, the fragile peace of an afternoon where children could play in the streets without fear. All of it was fragile, all of it was precious, and all of it depended on their ability to resist the urge to pull apart. So when danger came, as it always does, they did not scatter. They resisted the instinct to retreat into the perceived safety of their own four walls. They gathered. They opened their doors. They walked out onto their porches and into the streets, not in panic, but with purpose. They moved toward the center, toward each other, creating a gravity of their own. Neighbors watched for each other. A light left on too late, a curtain that remained drawn, a silence that felt too heavy. These were signals. A network of quiet vigilance was their first line of defense, a web of caring eyes and ears that ensured no one faced the encroaching darkness alone. Churches became planning rooms. Sanctuaries transformed into strategy centers. Basements once used for fellowship were now filled with maps and charts as people from all walks of life huddled together, their diverse skills and knowledge becoming a shared resource. They planned, they organized, they prepared. Communities stood between violence and the next generation. They formed a living wall, a shield of ordinary people with extraordinary resolve. Their bodies became the barrier, their unity the fortress. Behind them, life could continue. Behind them, the laughter of children was a defiant anthem of hope. Because if one family fell, if one home went dark, if one voice was silenced, the future fell with them. They understood that a community is a delicate ecosystem. The loss of one part weakens the whole. A crack in one foundation threatens the entire structure. The future was not an abstract concept. It was embodied in every single person, every single family. So they made a covenant, a solemn promise, not to a flag or an institution, but to each other. It was a pact sealed, not with ink, but with action. An injury to one is an injury to all. This was their guiding star. When a roof was damaged, it was everyone's roof. When food was scarce in one home, every pantry was opened. When one heart was broken, the entire community shared the burden of its mending. This was not a slogan. It was not a platitude to be spoken and forgotten. It was the daily, grinding, beautiful work of community. It was hammers and nails, soup and bread, a shared blanket, a quiet word of encouragement. This was survival. It was the pragmatic, necessary, and deeply human response to a world that sought to break them. It was the recognition that their individual strength was magnified tenfold by their collective will. And when they stood together, when the farmer stood with the teacher, the mechanic with the doctor, the old with the young, they became something more than a town. They became a force. They moved freedom forward, not just for themselves, but for the generations yet to come, proving that the most powerful act of defiance, the truest expression of liberty, is the simple, profound, and unbreakable promise to stand
Said
as
slavery
one.
ended. They said we were free, but freedom isn't a word on paper. It's not a speech. It's not a promise whispered in the dark. Freedom is protection. Freedom is land that cannot be stolen. Freedom is children who can learn without fear. Freedom is a future that doesn't depend on someone else's approval. After emancipation, they built towns, they built schools, they built churches, and every time they rose, something tried to push them back down. Burned homes, broken laws, silent erasure. But here's what they understood. Freedom is not something you negotiate. It is something you defend. They did not survive chains to debate their right to be free, and neither will we. Freedom is non-negotiable.
Commandment 10. Thou shalt never return to chains. Freedom is non-negotiable. They tried to negotiate freedom. They tried to water it down, delay it, redefine it, rename it. They said, be patient. They said, this is progress. They said, you can have some rights, but not all. They dressed restriction up in language that sounded reasonable. They wrapped injustice in paperwork. They framed control as order. But chains do not disappear just because you rename them. After emancipation, freedom was supposed to be settled, supposed to be finished, supposed to be done. But freedom was not secured with one document. It had to be defended again. And that defense did not begin with speeches. It began with land, with schools, with banks, with churches, with towns that said, we will build where we are not welcome. Freedom was not abstract. It was structured. And when you structure freedom, you protect it. They called it separate but equal. They called it law and order. They called it tradition. They called it economic policy. But let's tell the truth. Every generation faces a version of the same negotiation. Compromise just a little. Adjust your expectations. Accept less. And each time it sounds reasonable. It sounds temporary. It sounds manageable. But erosion never announces itself loudly. It happens slowly, piece by piece, policy by policy, narrative by narrative. And before long, what was once a right begins to feel like a privilege. That is how freedom is negotiated away, not with chains placed back on wrists, but with systems that quietly narrow opportunity, that quietly redraw access, that quietly redefine who belongs. And if you are not watching carefully, you won't notice the shift until the structure has already moved. Chains don't disappear just because you rename them. They change shape. After 1865, there were no auction blocks, but there were restrictions. There were codes. There were economic traps. There were barriers dressed as bureaucracy, and yet people built anyway. In places like Eatonville, in places like Mound Bayou, in places like Nicodemus, across the nation, communities rose with one shared understanding. Freedom must be protected collectively, not symbolically, collectively. That meant buying land together, teaching children together, defending one another together. That meant unity was not optional. It was infrastructure. And infrastructure requires maintenance. It requires vigilance. It requires memory. Because the moment you forget what chains look like, you become vulnerable to new ones. El freedom is not fragile, but it is not automatic either. It does not sustain itself without guardians. Our ancestors did not survive to hand us caution. They survived to hand us responsibility. Responsibility to teach the truth. Responsibility to protect land. Responsibility to defend dignity. Responsibility to refuse regression. Commandment 10 is simple. Do not return economically. Do not return mentally. Do not return historically. Freedom is not seasonal. It is not political fashion. It is not negotiable. And if history teaches us anything, it is this. What was built with sacrifice must be guarded with intention, not fear, not anger, intention, because the fight continues, but so does the building, and that choice remains ours. After 1865, freedom was supposed to be settled, but in places like Eatonville and Mound Bayou and Nicodemus, freedom had to be defended again, not with speeches, with land, with schools, with banks, with churches, with women standing in roads, with men guarding ballot boxes, with children learning to read by candlelight. Freedom was never gifted, it was guarded. And here's the part we don't always say out loud. Freedom is not negotiable, not politically, not socially, not economically, not spiritually. If it can be voted away, it was never secured. If it can be intimidated away, it was never rooted. If it can be silenced away, it was never owned. Those towns understood something we are still learning. You don't visit freedom, you build it. You don't borrow freedom, you defend it. You don't negotiate freedom, you live it fully. Commitment 10 is not about the past. It's about the line we draw today, because history shows us something clearly. Every generation is asked the same question. Will you protect what they built, or will you slowly trade it away for comfort, for silence, for division? Division is the oldest weapon against freedom, and unity is its shield. That's why the final commitment is not poetic, it's practical. Freedom is non-negotiable, not in your mind, not in your body, not in your spirit, not in your schools, not in your vote, not in your community, not ever again. They rebuilt after burning. They organized after terror. They educated after prohibition. They voted after intimidation. They loved after loss. And they did it knowing it could all be taken again. That is courage. That is discipline. That is commitment 10. And if we say we honor them, if we say we tell their stories, then we don't just remember their freedom, we protect ours. Because freedom is not a moment in 1865. It is a decision. Every day. And today, we decide again. Freedom is non-negotiable. Freedom is not negotiable. Not in 1865. Not in 1919. Not in 1963. Not now, because when something is negotiable, it can be bargained away. And our ancestors already paid the price. They paid in land stolen in towns burned, in schools underfunded, in names erased from history books. But they did not pay so we could debate whether freedom is optional. They built anyway. They taught anyway. They protected anyway. They voted anyway. They organized anyway. From Eatonville to Mound Bayou to Freedmen's Town to Nicodemus, across this nation, not because it was easy, because it was necessary. Responsibility. Freedom is not negotiable, but it is transferable. Each generation either protects it or weakens it. There is no neutral ground, and that's where we come in. Teachers, parents, students, storytellers. If we don't tell these stories, someone else will rewrite them. If we don't teach our children their inheritance, they will believe they have none.
And I refuse to let that happen. Pride with strength.
There is a difference between pride and posture. Pride rooted in truth builds communities. Posture without substance collapses. Our pride must be disciplined, informed, strategic. That's what those women showed us when they stood in the road. That's what the midwives showed us when they guarded futures before they were born. That's what the builders of black towns showed us when they created banks, schools, newspapers, and hospitals without permission. They understood something. Freedom must be structured. So what does that look like now? It looks like literacy, ownership, economic discipline, community cooperation, political awareness, cultural memory. It looks like refusing to hand our narrative to algorithms and hoping for the best. It looks like finishing what they started. And yes, it looks like you watching this to the end, because this is not entertainment. This is instruction. Now we've walked through all 10, not as slogans, but as survival blueprints. You've seen the defense, you've seen the building, you've seen the unity. So now we reveal them together, all 10, not scattered, not separated, whole. Because when you see them together, you see the pattern. And when you see the pattern, you see the power. Freedom is not negotiable. It never was. It is not a trend. It is not a moment. It is not a hashtag. It is a responsibility. And if we are honest, it is a test. Will we protect what they built, or will we consume it? Will we unify, or will we fragment? Will we teach the children who they are, or let someone else define them? The choice is ours now. They moved freedom forward. The question is, will we?